inclusivity and diversity have become buzzwords as America grapples with the social revolution that has been brewing for the past decade. Conflicting ideologies on race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and immigration are at a boiling point in our nation, and the protests and riots we witnessed this past summer certainly provide evidence to this claim. Part of the problem is our lack of education and recognition of the oppression and marginalization specific groups have had to overcome, and in many cases still face today. So whose responsibility is it to formulate the narratives we learn about the past? Whose responsibility is it to give a voice to those whose silenced histories still are not evident today? And who is responsible for creating an inclusive and diverse environment from which to drive social change?
It is my view that one of the most important issues that we art museum directors must wrestle with is how we will bring greater diversity and an inclusive culture to our museums. And that means diversifying our boards, our staff, the content of our exhibitions, and certainly our visitorship. Discussing these issues can involve awkward conversations and difficult dialogues. But as Audre Lorde, the well-known Black lesbian poet, said, "Your silence will not protect you."
The problem with inclusivity in museums is a twofold issue. First, museum accessibility from both a financial and logistical standpoint, and second, a museum's willingness to break away from past ideologies and tackle the issues of oppression, marginalization, and trauma from the narratives of those affected. According to the Center for the Future of Museum Statistics, the attendance rate of minorities at American museums made up only 9% compared to comprising nearly 35% of the population. While these figures can be attributed to the lack of transportation options and the cost of attending a museum exhibit, this report includes statistics from museums that often offer low-cost or free admission and accessible public transportation. Therefore, it must be the museum's internal exclusionary practices that must be at the heart of this problem. There lies a fear amongst museum curators, directors, and boards to strive for more inclusionary practices, as it could result in political or financial pressure to return to the previous operational methods. However, I'd like to take the time to talk about the advantages of becoming an inclusive museum. Primarily, it allows for an expanding of the museum's role in society and allows for deeper engagement on the issues of race, gender, sexuality, politics, and religion. While becoming a more inclusive institution will require some loss of control as to the exhibits, collections, and narratives, it will create an environment to facilitate cultural exchange and open communication lines with the communities that you serve. Open communication aligns with the concepts of self-curation and allows for the inclusion of quote-unquote others when creating an interpretation of history. Inclusion also answers two important questions with regard to society. Is there a problem, and is there a solution? And the answer to both is in the affirmative. Inclusions allow for an awareness concerning societal problems and marginalization within society, and not only directs attention to it, but also provides a response on how to change the current societal path.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Three distinct areas come into focus that continue to plague the museum profession. First, The denial of the alive and thriving ideology of racism in America. Second, systemic racism and prejudices undermine minorities and marginalized groups and have created a lack of inclusive processes within the museum profession. And third, the obliviousness to the importance inclusivity and integration have to the nation's changing demographics and its correlation to your success in the future. One of the things you'll continually hear me say about these topics is it's not supposed to be comfortable. So let's talk about racism. The word integration is antithetical to segregation, so there is no surprise that ideas surrounding minorities and marginalized people's integration into society bring up emotions and sentiments paralleling those of the civil rights era. Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian, provides even more evidence to support these concerns in analyzing the atrocious representation of minorities in executive leadership positions within American museums. Perhaps most frustrating are the figures that prove that American institutions of a historical and artistic nature are quote-unquote whiter now than they were at the height of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Jeanette Cole adds that only 20% of museum employees comprise people of color, and those are primarily people involved in medial and non-curatorial platforms. Now you may say to yourself, well, museum professions simply are not within the sphere of interest for minorities, and those that acquire higher educations must prefer specialities that provide more financial stability and greater authority and prestige. Guess what? That's racist. These and other comparable statements should be cause for concern as they are simply not based in fact and introduce the second area which plagues museum professions: ignorance. This ignorance is pervasive throughout the entire institution of museum culture. Hiring qualified minorities is just not that difficult, and the statistics provide evidence that despite this fact, only 5% of museum leadership roles are filled with people of color. The final area that plagues the museum profession is the lack of acknowledgement of the changes underway concerning audience demographics and museum profitability for the future. The demographics of the United States have been rapidly shifting from a majority of white European descendants to non-white and mixed-race lineages. Museums are losing the opportunity to ignite interest within what will become the majority shareholders of America. One-off exhibits on slavery, women, LGBTQ+, and Native peoples damage the reputation of a museum and push away potential economic opportunities for the future of your museum's growth.
It might make sense as a starting point and an effort to ground our discussion to offer some simple definition of terms. So the AAM has defined diversity as, bear with me, it's a long definition, but the quality of being different or unique at the individual or group level. This includes age, ethnicity, gender identity, language differences, nationality, parental status, physical, mental, and developmental abilities, race, religion, sexual orientation, skin color, socioeconomic status, education, work and behavioral styles, the perspectives of each individual shaped by their nation, experiences, and culture, and more. And they go on to say, even when people appear the same on the outside, naturally they are different. Inclusion. While diversity exists always in social systems, inclusion, on the other hand, must be created in order to leverage diversity. An environment must be created where people feel supported, listened to, and able to do their personal best.
Museums, historical sites, and schools all share a responsibility to shape society. And this responsibility requires that all members of society have a seat at the table of interpreting and investigating historical events, especially in the case of one's personal or community history. According to Chandra Lebouvier, the first Black author of a Guggenheim catalog, the problem is exclusively in the narrator's unreliability concerning marginalized people, people of color, and people whose history has been erased or silenced. Historical institutions have historically erased entire movements, generations, and cultures, and have lost public trust within those communities affected by past iniquities. When a Black, Latino, Native, gay, or disabled person enters a museum, there is an overwhelming underrepresentation feeling. Perhaps a more critical component of this underrepresentation is the reality that when a marginalized group is represented, their history, artifact, and artwork are interpreted through the lens of a white, heteronormative male. And in most cases, their oppressor. Underrepresented communities, silenced minorities, and oppressed groups will not tolerate a lack of inclusion concerning their place in history, their interpretation of events, and their inclusion in the future. Museums, boards, directors, and curators that acknowledge these facts are poised to create successful partnerships that will guarantee sustainable institutional success in the future. Those who fail to adapt, fail to submit, and fail to adhere to the public demands will cease to be useful and will ultimately lose their place in society. In the near future, it will be inconceivable for visitors to attend an exhibit on the Founding Fathers and the Constitution without investigating the inequalities, discrimination, and prejudices that were inherent at the time of its writing. Furthermore, an exhibit on the presidency of Ronald Reagan would not be complete without representing the devastating effects his policies had on the gay community as they suffered the consequences of the AIDS epidemic. Lastly, no one's going to be visiting plantation museums without an interpretation and investigation of the life of the slaves that built and worked on those locations. Simply looking at pretty dresses and cookware is certainly not going to cut it for the demography of the United States in the future. The lack of in-depth interpretations, their effects on the full scope of the general population, and the lack of diverse and inclusive voices in creating exhibits will continue to affect the success of historical institutions for the future. You must create spaces where people feel they belong and where they feel welcome to participate in interpreting the history. This is paramount. Black, Native, queer, women's, immigrant, disabled, and Latino history is a part of American history. You as the curator, board member, and museum director must utilize the experiences and interpretations of these marginalized groups from this moment forward. It is time now for you to actively seek out marginalized persons for employment, interpretation, and audienship, where you can start looking for a new career. The importance of inclusion and diversity in the museum profession cannot be overstated. And I want to conclude with the story of the little boy who went to the museum with his blind mom. And as they...
Got it?
I don't want to be here.
James, I want you to pick an artwork you like and tell me about it. Art is a wonderful thing and I want to enjoy it with you, okay? What do you see?
Sit here.
Okay.
Before you towers a terrifying scene of war. Thousands of horses break the grassy ground in a cavalry charge. Soldiers sporting blood-red uniforms ride with valor in a fearless resolve to attack. Some blow military bugles, others raise their voice in a war cry. Mighty silver blades are exalted above their heads. Leading up front, a commander on a mighty white stallion. The beast's eyes were wide and ferocious, every muscle and vein pulsing through his skin. The commander rides the steed high, his face blazing with heroism, but still in his eyes a glimmer of fear. For at the front line, survival is not guaranteed.
I'm so proud of you.
Can you describe that one to us over there?